exciting. And thank you for inviting me to this talk. What we're going to talk about really is higher education and how much of what we're doing today came out of the military, came out of different initiatives. And I don't think a lot of us understand that one of the reasons we're able to do what we're doing during COVID is really because of the innovations from the military to serve its members on a global scale. And I always find it intriguing that things we now take for granted have their history and roots in not only alternative programming, but a lot of that alternative programming actually comes out of the military. So I'll give you a little background on me, and then we'll actually go through the slides. I'm only going to try to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for dialogue and question. I grew up in the military. My father is originally from Albuquerque and went to UNM, got his degree in civil engineering, and then got a commission as a pilot in the Air Force. He was one of the first few Hispanic pilots for the Air Force. So I'm really remarkably proud. He flew F-86s out of Tacoma, Washington, and then went to B-52s. He flew B-52s for many, many years of his crew. He was the youngest aircraft commander, spent a lot of time during Vietnam overseas, flying out of Guam and Utapao. And his last airplane is the one that's behind me, which I think is one of the prettiest airplanes in the world. It's one of the first swing wings. What he flew was the FB-111. There's A models, which are attack, but his airplane not only did attack, but also did bomb. It was a strategic aircraft command airplane. So you'll see a picture of my dad at the very end. So I'm really proud of my dad. But growing up in the military, you know, we live in a lot of places. I've lived all over the country. I count my moves by the number of times I moved into houses. My last move into my last rental here was number 49. 14 high schools by the time I graduated, 14 schools by the time I graduated high school. So change is not something I fear, but I think one of the best things that ever happened to me was when I went to college. I came out here to UNM. My father made me live with my grandmother, and my husband, then boyfriend, came. We moved back to New Hampshire where my father was stationed, and we dropped out of college. We got married, and we ended up overseas in England. And you know, my dad was real disappointed. Oh, you're never going to get a college degree. Well, there was this institution over there called the University of Maryland University College. And they have been around, oh gosh, long, long time, probably 80 years now. But they were established predominantly to serve military members globally. So I was able to finish my bachelor's degree there with Maryland. And I did something called a CLEP test. And they transferred all my credits, and the classes were in the evening, and they were in 8-week formats. And it was just something I, as a traditional student, never even knew existed. And that really started my career. I started, once I had my bachelor's, we were at a very small little base in England called Wethersfield. And it was a munitions weapons storage site for emergencies. And in order to work at the education center, you had to have a bachelor's degree. And so once I got my degree, I applied to Maryland or the Ed Center to be their contract guidance counselors for the military. And then this world opened up to me of alternative education. Access for folks who didn't normally have a front door in, or didn't want to go in the front door at the time when they graduated for college or high school, or maybe they didn't have the grades to get into college. You know, that happens. Or they fell in love and got married like we did and needed to finish later. So this whole world of alternative education opened up to me. And as I got more and more into the history of adult education, which is my discipline area, if you will, I learned a lot about the military. And I did a lot of military training over my career. I worked with the military and Department of Defense at military bases in England and in the US. As I started to learn the history of all these things, I became aware that a lot of the things that I had been working with our students were actually founded within the military structures. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and we will walk through these cool innovations, hopefully. So here's a question for you, and I should have built in a little bit of polls. that distance learning really has much of its grounding in the way we do it today from the military. And how many of you know that the GED has its foundation from the military? You've heard of college level examination programs, credit for learning outside the classroom, special funding programs, and overall concepts of adult learning are actually grounded and founded through the military. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson here because it's kind of fun to see where things start. And we're going to take some topics one at a time and go through them. So when I started working at the education office, I heard this term USAFI all the time. And all I knew was that we would get these really old transcripts that were done on typewriter and they were yellowed. And some institutions would take college credit off of these USAFI transcripts. And so it was actually an organization that the military requested, and you'll see, I'm not going to read to you, but asked the American Council on Education to come up with a program to help military members and when they become veterans, to take what they learned in the military, living overseas, for example, and how they could equate that to different things. And one of the first things they did was to develop the GED during World War II. And why that's significant is during World War II, a number of our civilians, males predominantly, decided to join up and go overseas and fight. And so they gave up their high school careers. They didn't graduate from high school. And even back then, to get some really decent jobs, back then, what we got required for a bachelor's degree now, you needed a high school diploma. So USAFI worked with the American Council on Education to figure out an assessment tool so that people could get, when they came back or while they were in the military overseas, they could get their GED, their General Education Development Test, which is really an equivalency for high school. So the GED has its beginning foundation from the military. They recognized that people were willing to go overseas, but they shouldn't be penalized at the same time. And so they developed the GED. And out of that came additional things. These CLEP tests came, once they realized they could do it for the GED, they thought, well, what about trying to do it for college courses, basic college courses? For example, English, people who write in the military, they have to write reports and stuff, communications. So they started to develop tests that were college equivalency. And the Dante's actually was one of the first tests, the DSSTs. And these are exams that we can do today. Our students, if I work with any adult learners, I'll say, well, maybe we lose tuition on it, but you like to do history. You do a lot of history reading. And I saw Peter Linder on here. So I might say, oh, don't go take Peter's class. Why don't you take an intro to history course? And we take them here at Highlands. We will grant 3 credits if they get a certain score, and they can get a gen ed taken care of by taking that history exam or math exam. I don't want to go into details, but the Dante's exams are very similar, but they tend to be courses that are at the higher level. So for people who are in the military, many of them go into leadership roles. And when they go into leadership roles, the military is outstanding at providing training for leaders. So they can take tests to see if they have the concepts down for, I don't know, introduction to management or frontline supervision, or maybe maybe they do finance for the military, so they can take some finance exams. So, some of the cool things that came out of USAFI were these exams that evaluate learning that has occurred outside of a traditional classroom. And that was really innovative at the time, and it still is, because a lot of folks don't know that they can do this, but this came out of the military saying we need to be able to do this for our service members, way back in 42, all the way to where we are today. And people who are active duty in the Guard and reserves can take all of those tests for free. They have study guides available to them, so it's pretty cool. And so all of our students can take them as well. Our students can take them, but they have to pay for them, but it's still more cost effective than taking a 3-credit class. Well, probably from one of our community colleges, not. But if they're willing to do some self-study, they can do it on their own time and their own convenience. So let's talk about what we're doing now. We're doing this at a distance. We're doing all kinds of, everybody across the globe is doing distance everything these days. So how in the world does that get its foundation out of the military? So USAFE not only asked, how can we give college credit or high school equivalency for learning, but how do we train our troops? Now, there's a great book that there's some references at the end called, it's about learning and knowledge, and actually correspondence courses, when you get to the very, very beginning of them, believe it or not, the first group here in the US to really engage in correspondence was Harvard University in its foundation. They used to do correspondence courses for adults who were wanting to be clergy way back in the 1600s. But the military took that concept even further. So they decided to, on a global scale, develop courses that the military could take in a whole variety of areas. They could take courses in electronics, they could take English, they could take history, they could take leadership, or they would be taking training for their work environment. So my husband was, I doubt if you could do the pilot too well without the seat time, but my husband was a munitions officer. And so he took some courses on leadership. He took some of his procurement classes all through correspondence. And back in the World War II, they did the same thing. They would send out correspondence courses, and you can see here that even POWs took these correspondence courses. People on the front line, people that were in the, back in the support offices. This is how they continued not only their formal education, but their training. And in formal education, I'm also including training that they could use to get a job when the war was over and they came back. And you can see that one of the cool things that they would do, and we still do this today. So in today's environment for distance learning, a lot of institutions that work well with the military, and I'll use the University of Maryland as an example. Well, actually, I used the university that I worked at before, Park University. We worked with the Navy to provide courses on ship and underwater with the submarines. We would hire a faculty who had the credentials to teach a particular course, and the people on the ship or the submarine would sign up for that course with us, and we would hire our adjunct from the officer ranks or the enlisted ranks of somebody who had the academic credential to teach that course. So while they might have been out on a 6-month deployment, I don't know if it's called deployment in the Navy. I don't know my Navy language really well. I got Air Force down and some Marine and some Army. So distance learning for the military became the norm. And as we look at our history of higher education, much of that history has been adopted by higher education because, if you will, the military sort of served as the guinea pig to see if it would work. And it works really, really well. And people were getting outstanding education as a result of it. What I will say is that some of the things that came out of it, and I didn't include one piece here, the military is outstanding at developing curriculum and training. They use a lot of the theories and materials we use in instructional design today come out of the military model for training and developing training. So they know how to do distance. They know how to do it on a global scale. But mostly in my head, one of the things that the military did for distance was they began to develop best practices and quality standards. And that's really, really very important when we think about education in general, of how we use it in higher education. Our rubrics are using learning outcomes based on Bloom's taxonomy. The military's been doing this for 60, 70 years, and we're really just beginning to get to that point with the here with higher education. We're gonna jump over to the GI Bill, which many of you know about, but this is a great little quick video. And then I want to talk about how the GI Bill really transformed the concept of adult learning globally here, well, nationally at least. And it became a recognized concept of working with adults who want to go back to school. So hopefully this will work. Let's see. Callie, I can see you. Can you see the video?
Even before the close of World War II, President Roosevelt was concerned about
Yeah.
I can say it.
Thank you.
May return home. The original GI Bill, signed into law on June 22nd, 1944, has been called one of the most significant pieces of legislation ever passed by Congress. The results transformed the United States socially and economically.
A surprise military strike by Japan on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. Soon millions of young men were sent to fight major battles overseas. One of them was Guy Whidden.
That was shocking. Right away, everybody young wanted to join up.
By 1944, the high school senior was parachuting into Normandy. While Whidden played out his adventure overseas, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a bill that would secure his future.
The GI Bill was a product of a lot of thought and planning during World War II. It was designed to make sure that the shift from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy came without the United States slipping into a recession or depression.
Cornell University historian Glenn Altshuler explains how key provisions of the GI Bill transformed the country.
Maybe the most famous one was a provision for higher education. And there, GIs could get up to $500 of tuition, and that would cover tuition at any private or public institution in the United States at that time.
Free tuition and money in his pocket from the government made Guy Whidden a popular guy on campus as he pursued his teaching degree.
GI Bill, best thing that ever happened. Free education all the way. I got about 5 years out of it.
The Veterans Administration made sure GIs like Whidden knew they had benefits coming to them.
There were many things that were done by the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration produced a number of brochures and distributed those brochures to the GIs when they were mustering out.
That the Japs have surrendered unconditionally.
For people who were poor, for people who came with families where no one had gone to college and no one aspired to go to college, having that opportunity made available was absolutely critical.
Soon, universities and colleges across the countries were crowded. Paratroop veteran Milton Greenberg joined the thousands flooding campuses and classrooms.
This is a collage of photos given to me as a going away gift when I left my position at the American University.
This child of an immigrant family rose to be professor emeritus at a prestigious university thanks to the GI Bill.
It was a miracle what happened. Every campus was like a shipbuilding industry. There was buildings going up everywhere.
Before the war, fewer than 5% of Americans had a college degree, and only 2/5 had a high school diploma. The GI Bill greatly expanded those figures. By 1947, veterans made up half the nation's college student body. And by the end of the program in 1956, 8 million veterans had received a university degree or job training.
Retired economics professor Bob Aronson got more than his master's degree from Princeton on the GI Bill.
We were quite happy here. The kids loved the neighborhood.
He used the bill's low-interest loans to buy his first house.
Well, what you're seeing there is the front of the living room that had a wood-burning fireplace.
With the GI Bill's no-money-down mortgage, the former B-24 Navigator purchased the two-bedroom home for less than $10,000.
It never occurred to me to wonder, was the government going to do anything to compensate me for the loss of time and opportunity? I thought it was very generous.
America's doctors and engineers and teachers, the ranks of those professions were bolstered by the GI Bill. We've had famous Americans and anonymous Americans, each doing their part in this great American society because of what the GI Bill allowed them to do. It really allowed them to reach their potential.
Originally, the Roosevelt administration estimated only 700,000 GIs would take advantage of the GI Bill. In the end, more than 8 million used one or more of its provisions.
So let's talk a little bit about the GI Bill. Whoops, let me go back a slide. One of the things that was really quite interesting is back then, in the good old days, several things were not very common in colleges. One was married students. Whoa, hang on. I need to,
Amazon, Facebook,
hang on a sec.
They're all betting on a radical new technology that will change the way we live.
I can't get to my thingy here. Hang on.
Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak. The Wall
Hang
Street
on.
Journal agrees, calling it foundational.
We'll turn that off and I'll have to share my screen, I think. Can you see that screen? Probably not. You can? Okay, let me get back to the GI Bill. Sorry about that. So we didn't have married students. We didn't have adult learners. They were very traditional students, as you heard. And a lot of the things that were going on in the, when the GIs came back, and these are direct quotes from people, colleges and universities will find themselves converted into educational hobo jungles. They really thought that the adults coming back, that the GIs, men and women, were going to taint the classroom, that they didn't, they felt that they were not going to be capable of going to college. They didn't think they'd have the skill sets, the critical thinking. They felt that they would be, because they were GIs, they'd come in and taint the classroom in general. And on the other hand, on the Newsweek there, you'll see that once the GI Bill hit, colleges saw money. But what happened was, as GIs, as the veterans started going into the classroom, several things happened. They discovered that the veteran, not only did they, were they mature students, they took their education very seriously. They turned out to be setting the standard for the classroom, and they outpaced the traditional age student. Their grades were higher. Their assignments were more comprehensive. They just sort of took over the classes, and to the colleges and university surprises, they outperformed in ways that they never thought of. So they started to build some concepts and theories around adult education. What was different about these individuals? Well, we'll talk about that later when we get to Q&A, but just think about yourself today. If you were in a classroom, your attitude and everything is different. They began to allow married couples. They did housing. But one of the questions that comes up about the GI Bill on a regular basis, there's a reference at the end here, and I'll point out the book to you if you're interested in learning more about the GI Bill, is what about equity? Who actually had the GI Bill? And so there's a lot of commentary about, yeah, most of the folks who used the GI Bill were from white minority population or majority populations. But the reality is that the populations that served in the military were proportionate to the number of people that actually served in the military. So I'll take the Hispanics and African American and Native Americans. So the number of those individuals that served in World War II, those individuals used the GI Bill at the same proportion that they were in serving in the military. But overall, the GI Bill did do a lot of good things in terms of providing education and training, and it wasn't always used for college. You know, we think of post-secondary education as always being college. A lot of people learned to be plumbers and carpenters and did a lot of vocational things with them. So where are we today? Well, today we have with the military, it's called the Defense Voluntary Education. And I'm not going to go through, but this is some of the things that they do. They're out of Florida, but they serve globally to all the military individuals, the veterans and reserve and guard members. And they serve their families. I was a spouse in England. Today, if I was a spouse in England and wanted to finish my degree, I go to the Education Center. I actually finished my master's degree through the Education Center at Offutt Air Force Base. I took most of my classes in at Offutt Air Force Base, not downtown at Creighton. So what's really exciting about this, though, is some of the things you see here are things that we actually begin to take part of in traditional higher education, places like New Mexico Highlands. And we adapt now that it's okay to take college military training and give our veterans college credit for it. It's okay to take exams and let people take, these exams and give them college credit for it. So while, this is what's going on today, we in higher education in general are beginning to adopt a lot of these things. Harvard has a really wonderful policy for transfer in their continuing ed division, Harvard Extension. So generally speaking, what we have is the military has brought to us in traditional higher education an acceptance and foundation and format for how we do distance delivery, how we develop those components and those modules for training. We can break them down. So when we deliver a course online, we decide to do, we don't do correspondence, but essentially distance is correspondence, if you will. We can do it knowing that there's quality and best practices that have been researched by the military. And now we have many, many folks in higher education that are doing our own research. And how does that translate into our classrooms, which are different? Assessment of learning from training. This is something that the military does really, really well. If you're a veteran, you know that, or if you're active duty or in the reserves or guard, you know that they know how to assess what you're doing really well. Very much competency-based, which is something that we're getting into more and more in higher education. You've heard of Western Governors University in Utah. They are completely competency-based. And so with the military, if you don't get your skill set down, you don't know how to load the bomb properly. You keep doing it until you get it right, over and over again until it's done. The one thing that I think that's really come for me is one of the greater advantages from the military is this notion of being able to test out of courses, being able to test your knowledge that you've learned outside of the classroom and getting acknowledgement for it. And the training that the military has done, and they do their own research, they really have very much tapped into and helped develop the concepts for adult education and training theory, how we approach the world of adults, how we approach veterans. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And as a result of this, if we go back to that slide that had the vol ed, it has helped to establish the field of non-traditional adult education as an industry and profession in and of itself. Up until my last institution, my career has been exclusively serving adult learners, many and most of them military members. There are doctorate degrees now in adult education and continuing education. There are conferences and organizations that do this. And when you look at the concepts and theories around all this profession now, there's a nice large strand that deals with working with the military veterans and their families and how you support them while they're doing their military obligations. And one or two more slides. So this one right here, Soldiers to Citizens. This is you can probably find it on Kindle. It's really a great book. It talks about some of the things that I pointed out, but it really talks about how veterans, through the GI Bill, through their education, became citizens that were more engaged. They're more engaged in social justice. They're more engaged in activities in their community. It's actually somebody's study. Whoop, it's time for me to stop. But it really does talk very much about how the veteran, through the education in the GI Bill, gave them the ability to be a stronger voice in the communities in which they live. They tend to be more active. They tend to be engaged politically in their school districts, in their churches, just all the way around. And so I've got I think they're going to record this, but we'll also make sure people can get the slides. I've got some other. So these are some just pictures, but the guy in the middle, the really good looking guy, that's my dad as a lieutenant, brand new to the Air Force. Isn't he handsome? And he looks just like my oldest son. So let me come over here and we'll stop sharing. If I can get my screen back up properly. Let me get this going. We'll stop sharing. And what I'd love to do is open the floor for comments and questions. Yes, he is very handsome. Thank you, Julie. So we didn't hear the video. Is that what I see here, or we did?
No, you ended up being able to be here. Somebody turned it up.
Oh,
So
okay. Thank you. I'm
that
sorry.
was good. Thanks.
So,
Roxanne.
thank you, Carol. For me, it's been a wonderful career that I've experienced. And what I really love about it is now that I'm serving in more traditional environments, I can see the translation of what has been done over here with the military through its history and how it's impacted what we do here today. And I think for me, as someone who's working here at NMHU, it gives me an opportunity to talk with our faculty and think about how we can do things differently to serve our overall population here at NMHU. You know, you don't have to be a veteran to take the CLEP test. You don't have to be a reservist to do the DSSTs. If you are, prior military, we should be taking your ACE credits that you got for your training. One of the things that I've been able to do at every institution that I've worked at, and it's probably because I really am so committed to our military, is I've been able to stand up veterans resource centers at every single institution I've been at. We're trying here, but for some reason, it's a little more difficult up here in northern New Mexico. So let's open up the floor and have questions and dialogue. I mean, it's just really exciting to me that they set the foundation for a lot of what we do. Carol.
I was just in listening to your talk, listening with Peter while we were eating, and then I signed on. So I really echo what you said about how we need to look at how the military educates people. I have learned a lot from my son's experience post the Naval Academy and going to nuclear power school and submarine school, is that they did not expect him. He already had a degree in engineering, but they retest and they redo the competencies and they retest all the time. I go, what are you doing? He goes, I'm studying, I'm retesting. And so it really has changed me as an educator of realizing I sort of am like, okay, you learned that, you should just know that. And the military doesn't do that. They always are recertifying, retesting all at every single level, even you have to pass it. And if you're not doing well, they don't fail you.
Right.
For the most part, they don't fail you. They really just say, what other support do we need to give you? How can we do this? You need to go on that. So that whole experience that we went through with our son really has changed in my thinking about how we educate in higher ed.
You know, I think you bring up some really important points, Carol, because first of all, he went to a military academy. So one thing that the military does that we don't do in the civilian sector, whether it's higher ed or Google or somebody, they require everybody to get leadership training. So they assume when you enlist or you become a new lieutenant and I forget what it is, an ensign in the Navy, they assume you're going to be a leader. And so they give you leadership training all along the way. And so they expect you to progress. So there's this notion that it's a positive environment, that you're going to be successful. And so they train you to be a leader, to Carol's point. And if for some reason you have been mismatched with your job and you can't make it, they'll cross-train you into another career field that might be more suitable. So, but they do the outcomes, they do things in small chunks, the modules. They do rubrics for every single activity or assessment. There's a rubric to tell you what you have to achieve. And the outcomes are measurable. It doesn't say, we'll understand. What does understand mean? Well, you can't really measure understanding. It's very specific. It's based on Bloom's. When they use, 500 years ago, when my husband was stationed in Saudi Arabia, he was in Dhahran, we started to communicate with this thing called email. And it wasn't a public thing yet. It was something that I could do because I was on a military installation. But I could do it because we had this thing called email. And it was really cool. It wasn't as fancy as we have today, but so a lot of the innovations that we use in higher education do come out of the military. You know, one thing I didn't ask earlier is how many veterans do we have online? Can you put your little reaction thing up and see how many veterans? Okay, we've got a few. Good. One of the questions, how does HU stand in terms of my thing of recruiting veterans? Great revenue. My son, a Marine in Somalia and in Iraq, used the GI Bill to get his bachelor's degree. Absolutely. Do we do a good job of it? I think this has been one of the challenges that we face here at NMHU. We do have potential, but some of the things that we have in place here at Highlands is changing our culture, changing the culture of who we are, to understand that when we serve adults, and I'm going to put the veteran in the same category as all adults, we recruit them differently, but we have to have some things in place that acknowledge what they bring to the table. For example, we should be able to take all the military credit if they're a veteran. We need to be able to allow them to take CLEP tests and Dante's exams and Excelsior exams. We need to be able to take all of their credit that they've taken at other institutions. A lot of military people, even with the online advent of online, they will attend 5, 6, 7 different institutions, and we should be able to transfer all of those credits in. And so we have some things in place, but not a lot. And so we're in competition with institutions who do the adult learner really, really well. Now our campus centers, I thought I saw Joe on here. Maybe Joe can speak to this a little bit because he's actually in Albuquerque. So Joe, maybe Joe Moreno, you can get on. But we do, I think, a more focused concentration and ability to do that at our centers. Joe, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the adult learner is exactly what we do. You know, most of our students, the average age is a little bit older than what probably we would say at the main campus. And so a lot of our outreach initiatives are aimed at recruiting adults. In fact, one of the discussions that we restarted lately was with the Army Reserve National Guard here in Rio Rancho. And so we're looking to do some really good work with them. Just restarting those. Dr. Wilson and I are fairly new now, I guess, to Highlands. And so we'd like to pick that up again. But, you know, it's one thing to recruit students, adult students, military students, but what mechanisms do you have in place once they're there, once they come to your center? You know, a lot of times they don't want to email you. They'll pick up the phone and call you, or they'll actually come in person and really want to have all of their questions answered right then and there. So we've done a lot to really overhaul our student services and outreach to do exactly this. I think we have a ways to go, but I think we're proud of what we've done so far.
Joe, you bring up something that I think is kind of ironic when you think about when I went to my last institution, and again, most of my experience has been direct service to adults and veterans. So I go to my last institution and I now have 18-year-olds living in the residence halls. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, so I have this campus 45 miles away that's all adults. I got that, no problem. But now on the main campus, I have about 800 traditionally aged students. And I'm thinking, oh, my life is going to be filled with dealing with their issues. What I discovered is that their issues are not as great. They have them, but the adult learner takes a lot of time. And I think most of us, and I knew that, but until I had that compare and contrast in my own experience, it was really very evident that adult learners do require more hand-holding. They come to it later. They're afraid. Maybe they've been out of college for 20 years or out of school. Maybe they went to high school and then they're coming back. They've forgotten how to study. They've got families. They've got all these outside commitments, their jobs. And so they do require more one-on-one than our traditional 18 to 22-year-olds often. And it's kind of it's not what you would think. You think, oh, they're adults. They're going to be able to do whatever. You don't have to deal with them. You don't even have to advise them. They're going to be able to do it. That's not true. They do take a lot more one-on-one. But once they get going, they're fine. But it's getting them through that initial couple of semesters to where they're comfortable enough to say, okay, I got this. Now I know what the process is and I know what to do. But they do take a lot to start with. Other comments or questions or stories? I can talk about the military all day long. Any more comments in the... So let me ask you guys a question, and I'd love for, we've got some alum on here and some faculty and some deans. What do you think we need to be doing to serve our veterans and our adult populations? Anybody? We got a dean in here. Let's see if we can get her to say.
I will just say that I think that you're right that we have to look and see what kind of support mechanisms, and I think Joe talked about that, but I do think that even especially now that we're more online and we're getting used to being that online, but how, are we, how are we reaching out to that, and just sort of some, additional, I think that you've provided a lot of professional development, and support in terms of core and that sort of thing. But I do think just as we look and don't necessarily have just the traditional population of students, that's all good for us as educators to think about that.
Yeah, the reason I sort of framed this in COVID is because we're doing distance education now, and the foundation of distance really does come out of that correspondence concept, and the military has been doing it globally for so many years now that it's second nature to them. And so we really do need to think, I like to sort of think historically. So when we're online right now, the foundation for that goes back to some of the things that the military did with correspondence. The GED, I mean, the first time I learned that was probably about 20 years ago. I had no clue that something so common in our culture today, and when we have programs across the country to help people get their GEDs, I had no clue that that was really something that was established to help our veteran. And as you start making those connections, it's kind of fun and interesting to see those. And so for COVID, for me, when I think about it, I think, well, we're able to do this because of all the things that have come before. Email, that comes out of science and research with the military, the distance learning, the technologies that we're using here. My husband did a lot of stuff at Hanscom with training, and some of the technologies that we're using in terms of video came out of Hanscom Air Force Base's research in video technology and being able to be this interactive. If you think about, years ago when we first started with the internet, just think, my first computer was actually a VIC-20, Commodore VIC-20, and the software was on a cassette player. You put it in, clicked play, and it would take 10 minutes just to load the Word doc thing that I could type in. And where we are today, I mean, the military really does lend a lot of these things, but I do think that if we want to attract more veterans and their family members, we have to think, and it's not just the veterans, the adult learners, we have to think about our policies more and provide that opportunity for our adults in particular to be able to do alternative. A lot of people will say, well, that's going to take tuition away. Well, all you need to do with this is 90 credits anyway, or 30 credits. So why not get that person finished off, let them get their degree from Highlands, and then they'll come back to us with their master's degree. So you might lose some tuition here, but you're gaining an alum here. You're gaining somebody who was served really, really well and will be our advocate in the field to other potential students, to their corporate environment. And so there's payoffs on there, and some things you can't pay enough for somebody who's had a wonderful experience here at Highlands. For them, that's the best marketing. I had a great experience. They let me do CLEP exams. They took my military. I was able to do my courses by distance. And at the same time, I could go to Rio Rancho for a couple of courses that I really wanted to do on ground. That flexibility is what our adults are looking for today. And for the military, they're looking for something that they could take anywhere, anytime, any place. And that's asynchronous, not what we're doing now. And we're getting ready jump into the pond with that model. We'll see how we do. I think we'll be fine, but it's new for Highlands and it's exciting. It's very exciting for us. It's a culture shift for us. Any last minute comments or questions? I put up a B-52 in the back as well, just so I forgot to get an F-86, but that's a B-52. That airplane is over 50 years old and they expect it to fly for another 40 years. It is the workhorse of the military. It just keeps going and going and going. There are people who their great grandsons and granddaughters are now flying B-52s as pilots, which is pretty darn amazing to me. So, and they do still stand alert. When my dad was in, every other week he'd stay on base. He was on alert. And on the weeks he wasn't flying or on alert, and he lived underground in a bunker. And you've probably seen all those videos where they run out to the airplane and they get in and they take off. And they're fully loaded. They're ready to go should we have an event. Bay of Pigs is one I remember when I was remarkably little. My dad came home, grabbed his flight bag and told my mom it's probably the last time he's going to see us because they fully expected that there was going to be a nuclear war. It was weird. Those were the days when we used to hide under the desk in case there was a nuclear attack. But the B-52 has been around a long time. It's a workhorse for us. Comments, questions? If not, we can close down and you can reflect on the wonderful things that you are doing today in higher education as a result of our military environments. Well, thank you so much for attending. I appreciate your time. And I hope you learned a few things today. And it was fun too at the same time. It wasn't just a lecture.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez.